This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Hey, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, helping take your leadership to the next level. My name is Sam, and I'm joined by the man who thinks puns are a legitimate form of humor, Richard Blackaby.
That's and they're not?
Yeah, well, you know.
We'll have to have this conversation offline, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we'll toss it over to the audience if you guys want to jump in on this. Richard is very fond of puns, and most thinking individuals, I would say, are not. Although I will say there's been a few. There's been a couple that I can tip my hat to, but otherwise not so much. But we are not here to talk about puns.
No.
We're going to do the segment of the show, or the type of episode that so many of our listeners enjoy, and that is looking at a leadership profile.
Yeah. And biographies.
Biographies, something that Richard is very fond of, and if you've been listening to the show for any length of time, you know that he has a whole shelf or two in his library dedicated to biographies of great leaders around the world throughout history. And today we're going way back.
Oh yeah.
Tell us who we're looking at today, Richard.
I thought it was time that if we're going to do a leadership podcast, that we get to Julius Caesar.
Oh yes, classic. So why Julius Caesar? What has he done that we should be aware of, and that merits a podcast on leadership about him?
Well, there's certain leaders, especially military, political leaders, that just kind of stand out as key milestone kind of leaders. You think of Alexander the Great, you think of Napoleon.
Right. There's
just certain leaders that so dominated their age that they just rose head and shoulders above the rest. And Caesar is certainly one of those. And of course, he comes to the apex of the Roman Empire, which is the biggest, most powerful empire in the world.
Right.
And so to outmaneuver all kinds of leaders and politicians and generals, to stand head and shoulders above all of them, it was quite a feat. And of course, he will basically overcome the Roman Senate, and then his adopted nephew Octavian will end up becoming the first truly Roman emperor, who changes his name to Augustus. And so there's a lot about Caesar that is fascinating to people. And one of the issues with Caesar is just that it raises the issue of, number one, ambition. Ambition, is it wrong to be ambitious? Is it wrong to strive to make a name for yourself, to accomplish great things? Some would argue that much of history has been built around ambitious people that wanted to solve a problem for society, or to make a name for themselves, or to be a hero, a savior of the day. And Caesar's one of those guys. In that era, of course, the Roman Senate ruled the empire, and you had a couple hundred senators. Typically, they all came from noble families, the aristocrats, the moneyed families that ruled. They owned land and property, and were typically quite conservative. But at the same time, one of the challenges for Rome was that when Rome was established, it was not a real large territory to begin with. And so you could have a democracy, and people could have their say, and it was a nice system that was easy to manage for the most part. And they tried to avoid just having one king. So anyone who knows their Roman history knows that you actually had two consuls. So you didn't just have one top executive. You had two, with the idea that if one got a little too ambitious, the other one could kind of balance them out, and countermand their orders or whatever. And so even when it meant to leading an army, the consuls would take turns leading the army. So you just hope that the better general was in charge on the battle day. But but they only could serve for I think 2 years or so, and then they were they rotated out. So there was all kinds of checks and balances so that nobody could just take over, become a dictator. And for hundreds of years, that system had worked pretty well. But of course, as Rome keeps on conquering more and more territory, they need more and more soldiers, legions, to control all this territory. And so you're hiring greater and greater numbers of soldiers and putting them out on all the frontiers. And then, of course, those soldiers retire and they expect to get a pension, and that's costing a lot of money. And all of a sudden, you've got thousands of veterans who are all expecting you to take care of them. And and it began to create all kinds of strains on the empire that they hadn't counted on. And so people would, it's interesting because when the United States was being established, the going philosophy was that the U.S. was too big territorially for a democracy. That there's just no way that a democracy could vote on things and run things. You'd had to have someone more powerful to do that. And there were a lot of philosophers who said it's just impossible to establish a democracy in a country that big. And part of that was taken from looking at Rome and saying, well, as Rome got bigger, it just got harder and harder for a democracy to work. And so when you look at what Caesar does, he ultimately rises above all kinds of very ambitious men, particularly. He goes and spends 9 years as the governor over the province of Gaul, which is basically modern-day France. Ends up commanding over 10 legions, conquers all kinds of people. There's all kinds of statistics about what he ultimately did, battling over 3 million enemy soldiers, killing 1 million of them, imprisoning another 1 million of them, conquering over 800 cities. Just enormous. He actually led an amphibious landing of Great Britain, and actually went all the way to England and to the Thames River. He was just very ambitious. Fought a lot of very difficult battles. Had a race all over modern-day France, all the way into Germany, across the Rhine River, across the English Channel.
Wow.
And he just accomplished a lot of amazing things. He'd get to a raging, like the Rhine River, and have to figure out, how do we get across this thing? We've got enemy soldiers on the other side wanting to kill us. And he'd figure out how to engineer a bridge large enough to bring a whole army across. And he was just always adapting and doing whatever he had to. And of course, he wrote. He developed things like the Julian calendar. He promoted. He's always learning, and he's facing all kinds of intrigues. But the Senate is constantly worried about him. But he manages to outmaneuver them until finally the Ides of March catch up with him. But he just does all kinds of interesting things. When he was about just a young man, another dictator named Sulla is going around killing off a bunch of people just like him, and it's a miraculous that he survived. He should have been purged and killed. At one point, he's traveling in the Mediterranean and he's captured by pirates, and in that day, the pirates just sort of terrorized all the Mediterranean. They were out of control, and so they were gonna. They realized, we've caught a noble here. We'll hold him for ransom, and they demanded 26 talents for his freedom. And Caesar, I guess, typical of his arrogance and confidence, he said 26 talents was way too cheap for him. He was worth a lot more than that.
He told the pirates.
Yeah, he told the pirates, "You're asking for way too little for me. You should be asking for 50 talents of silver or gold, whatever." And so they put him to shore, and he's actually going to some noble family. He's like collecting the ransom, and finally helps to collect the 50 talents so that they release him. And so as soon as he gets released, he hires and basically rents a private navy of his own and goes after the pirates and
takes back
and actually captures the pirates, arrests them, and ultimately has him crucified and gets all the booty back. There's no record that he gave the 50 talents back to the people that paid it in the first place. But it was that kind of bravado that he became famous for. And of course, there's an interesting story when he was in Spain, when he was about 31, 32 years old or so. He came across a famous statue of Alexander the Great, and it was celebrating the fact that by the age of 31 or so, Alexander had already conquered the known world. At that time, Caesar has not really begun a lot of his exploits yet, and he wept. Caesar just wept because when Alexander was his age, he'd conquered the known world, and here Caesar is still just trying to kind of find his way. And it's always a kind of an irony of history that two of the most ambitious people certainly in the ancient world were challenging one another. Certainly Caesar felt challenged by Alexander to say, well, what great thing can I do? And so very interesting in that regard. A lot of things that Caesar did that just showed his brilliance and courage and ingenuity.
Yeah. So with him as a leader, what are some takeaways that we find in his biography?
Well, as a leader, they say that one thing is he studied oratory. He learned how to speak well, and he was trained as a lawyer. He argued cases in the courts. He could make great speeches to his men, and people just said that he spoke very well. But he actually trained to do that. He actually traveled to Greece and took classes in rhetoric so that he would be a good communicator.
Well, we've talked about that before on the podcast, that the importance of communication as a leader.
And don't assume if you're not that good at it that you can't improve.
Yeah. Here we have Julius Caesar, who presumably wasn't good at it.
Goes and takes classes in Greece. And they said he was always writing. Of course, this is obviously way before internet and so on, or even telephones, but he was constantly writing letters all the time. In fact, they said he was so driven that he could dictate 4 letters at the same time. So he'd have 4 different assistant scribes, and he'd be dictating 4 different letters simultaneously, which tells you something about Caesar and what he could do and how he could be getting so many things done.
Yeah, well, if I had 4 scribes, I could.
Yeah, maybe and he. And so he also just had a very strong communication line, so that even when he's over in Gaul, he always has people keeping him informed of what's happening back in Rome. And he's always sending messages back and keeping up with people because, of course, if you're a general serving out of the country, all kinds of things could be happening back in the center of the world in Rome that you're losing control of. And so he always knew what was going on, always let people know what he thought, and had his lieutenants, and he would actually pay money, be very as he's conquering all these tribes in Gaul and conquering these different kingdoms. He came across a lot of loot, a lot of booty. He tried to make sure his soldiers all got paid well for putting their life on the line for him, but he also would take lots of this money, and then he would pay off friends and allies back in Rome, so that even though he was away, there were people that were quite loyal to him to watch out for his interests. But they said he also, like Napoleon and others, that he always was very meticulous about taking care of his soldiers, made sure that they had enough to eat and drink and warm clothes to wear in the winter and so on. And he showed a definite concern personally for how his soldiers were doing. It was said that he shared in all of his soldiers' dangers and privations. Oftentimes he could have been carried along in a chariot or some kind of cart. Oftentimes he just walked along with his soldiers. And in many of the battles, he would, when his soldiers were growing faint and discouraged, or starting to retreat, there's a number of stories where Caesar would charge to the front of the line. At one point, they're fighting a bunch of these huge German soldiers, these barbarians, and they're quite fierce looking and acting and sounding, and some of his Roman soldiers were getting a little intimidated. Yeah. And so here goes Caesar, and he goes charging right to the front of the line, and he's actually hollering out at his centurions. by name, saying, "Come on, get your men up here. Come on with me. You know, we can take these." And that kind of heroism, of course, won him great loyalty from his soldiers.
Certainly.
And they just said that Caesar exuded confidence. And of course, when he didn't win every battle, but he developed this aura of success. And now there were a couple of times when he lost battles, when he was outmaneuvered or caught by surprise, but for the most part, when you were around him, you just assumed you're going to win.
Yeah.
And you might have a setback, but you knew you were ultimately, if you kind of hitched your wagon to him, you're going to win. And of course, he developed a track record of success. And just few things give leaders more influence than a track record of success.
Absolutely.
They said that maybe one or two other things. They said that he never just issued commands. He had a way of convincing people. And so it's one thing to say, "Hey, take that fortress up there." You could order people to do that, but he would convince people that they could do it and they should do it. And that was a world of difference in leadership between barking out an order, "Do that because I said so," and actually convincing your men that they.
I think that is a profound difference.
Yeah.
In leadership styles to order someone just because you say so, and then to show the people that you're leading why it is that you can and should and will do whatever it is that you have in mind for them.
And of course, a lot of leaders they're impatient. It's like, well, I don't have time to explain everything. Like, you don't need to know, just obey. But it takes patience and an investment in your people. But of course, that's a higher level of leadership. You also have a greater loyalty to you. And these soldiers ultimately would travel the world fighting on his behalf. One other thing that he did was he had what they called a policy of clemency for the most part. Certainly when he finally crossed the Rubicon and he went down into Italy and basically launched a civil war, in the past when other kind of dictators and usurpers had done that, if you came into Rome, people before him, there have been a couple of occasions where others had done a similar thing. But what you would do is you basically would kill off your opponents, especially if they're Roman senators. And you couldn't just kill off the Roman senator. You had to then kill off all of his kids who'd want to get revenge on you. And so basically there was bloodbaths. And if you were on the wrong side, you had to leave Rome because you knew they would literally post lists of names saying all these people are on our proscribed list. So if you find them, kill them and bring their bodies or at least their heads here, and we'll to confirm they're dead. And so there'd be, of course, mass exoduses. But Caesar basically just said, and now if you're a prime conspirator, one of the prime enemies, you're probably going to end up dead. But if you just chose the wrong side and you've been beaten in battle, he tended to just show a lot of clemency and forgiveness. And of course, in fact, a lot of soldiers ended up joining his army then, and he would say, "Well, we beat you, but hey, we need more good men. Why don't you join our army?" And so that kind of helped fill his ranks, and instead of just because he was fighting constant warfare for 15 or so years, and so he would have depleted his armies significantly if he had not had that policy. But so in one way, it gave him a number of friends. Ironically, it'll be senators that he didn't have killed that ultimately will assassinate him. So he left enemies around. He could have still, we could talk more about that. He probably could have still avoided being killed if he hadn't been so arrogant. Yeah. But he it's one of those philosophies where you say, look, if you grind your enemies to dust, you don't have to worry so much about them coming back to get you. But you're going to create, when your enemies have a chance, they're going to do the same to you. And Caesar had a certain amount of almost arrogance to say, I don't have to kill you. I'm so superior to you. I beat you so handily. I just am pretty confident that you're not stupid. You'll know it's better to join me than to keep fighting me. And so it was part arrogance, part brilliant strategy to say, if I just winner take all, then that's how my enemies will fight against me as well.
Interesting.
And so it worked for him right up until the end.
Until it worked until it didn't.
Yes.
Well, I think this is a good place to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Whether at home, on the job, or in the ministry, we can all have a greater impact on the world around us for the kingdom of God. Join Richard Blackaby at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove to learn about increasing your spiritual influence on April 6th through the 8th, 2020. Space is limited, so register soon at the link in the show notes. If you like what we're doing and would like to support our work, please consider making a donation. Even a little bit will go a long way toward keeping this podcast going for the months and years to come. To support this podcast, click on the link in the show notes. We are truly grateful for our wonderful community of listeners.
Well, Richard, as we know, any great leader is going to have some weaknesses, and Julius Caesar is no exception to that rule. So maybe you can share with us before we go, what are some blind spots perhaps and weaknesses in Julius Caesar that we can perhaps apply to our own life and look for.
Yeah, and by the way, I should just say the biography I base this out of is called Caesar by Christian Meier, and it's a little older. It's written, I think, in the early 1980s, but very scholarly, thorough work, and when you're writing it 2,000 years after the fact, not a lot of new stuff happens
exactly
in a decade or so. But a couple things about Caesar. One, of course, he became a great orator. He exuded confidence, and physically was quite strong, and able to live out on the field with the soldiers and fight all kinds of battles. He wasn't just sitting back on some mountaintop or hilltop looking from afar through his eyeglasses what his soldiers were doing. He was right down in there. But interestingly, and of course it's hard looking back 2,000 years, but a lot of experts believe that he may well have actually struggled with epilepsy, and that there were times when he actually would have seizures. And there was at least a couple of times where he sort of went almost missing. And it was very unlike him. A couple of times where he just wasn't himself or wasn't able to lead. At least one case where they thought someone dressed up like him was kind of charging into battle, but it may have been someone trying to just fill in for him while he was indisposed. And so, interestingly, if one of the greatest soldiers in ancient times was an epileptic, and actually had some times where he'd be overcome.
Wow.
There's a lot of speculation about that, but it seems like that may have been the case with him, which is, of course, we always talk about this, that even the greatest of leaders have their feet of clay, their physical ailments or personal, emotional struggles that they have to overcome, the demons they have to overcome.
That's not unique to any leader.
And it would be easy to say, well, I've got this physical malady. I can't be a soldier. I can't do this. Caesar obviously managed to overcome that.
Yeah.
He was, we said he's very ambitious. And one of the things he actually says, which is kind of interesting, when he's at the, when he's there at the Rubicon, he said, to refrain from crossing will bring me misfortune. But to cross will bring misfortune to all men. And of course, his ambition says, if I never cross this river, I'll never get what I could have gotten, become what I could have become. But if I do cross the river, there's probably a lot of soldiers are going to die. And of course, one of the big historic debates about ambition is, is ambition wrong if it may affect other people as well, either for good or for bad. But if you strive to get all you can, or to get to the top, or to make your company the number one in its market, what will that do to other companies? Will that cause other companies to go bankrupt and to lay people off? And so there's always it's always a double-edged sword there in terms of ambition.
Yeah. Well, I imagine there's also, I think we would all agree that there's a difference between this sort of personal ambition of, I want to be a known person. I want to leave my mark on the world, make my name great, versus, I want to just, I feel like we can fix this issue in humanity, or we can, overcome this problem with my company or what have you. That I feel like maybe there's a way to say there's ambition that is less self-centered,
right?
And ambition that is more self-centered.
Yeah, because I'm sure that there are scientists and doctors that have the ambition of being the person who cures cancer.
Yeah.
And I'd say, well, good for you. I give you all the fame and glory that you want. If you could do something like that would benefit so many other people. But yeah, I think for most leaders, at times they have to kind of think that through to say, well, is my ambition a noble thing? Is it something I should be ashamed of? Is my ambition leading me to step on people, to use people? And that was always a question for Caesar, was, am I using my soldiers? In fact, his biographer says he often concealed the fact how much he depended upon his soldiers. And so he tried to take care of them. He shared booty with them. Now, when they were invading Italy, he really prevented his soldiers from spoiling fellow Romans the way he would have let them do that in Gaul. And his soldiers got a little frustrated that there wasn't more loot for them, because that was kind of their payback. And so they began asking him, well, are we just putting our life on the line so you can become the dictator for life of Rome, or is this what's in it for us? And of course, Napoleon faced that too. A lot of people died so that he could become famous. And but there's several other things about Caesar. His biographer calls him an outsider, even though he came from a very long, an old aristocratic family. They weren't that successful. They didn't have a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And so he was kind of a second-rate aristocrat. and he was kind of viewed that way often. And so he never fit in, and he was never really accepted. And he knew that, and he didn't necessarily want to be accepted in one sense. That's partly what a lot of people have said. Sometimes outsiders have an advantage because they're not constrained by doing things the way it's always been done,
right?
And trying to not upset all your friends. If you don't have friends, you don't worry about upsetting them. And so there's no really record of him having a close friend, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah.
And there's things. He divorced a couple of wives. He at least one. He was married a couple of times. He would have affairs. In fact, one of his it was said his favorite mistress was actually the mother of Brutus, and of A2 Brute fame. And so there's always these little ironies in history. So here's Brutus, he thinks is his friend, who stabs him and actually leads the assassination attempt. But some people have speculated that, well, maybe part of why Brutus did that was this guy's been messing around with my mother. And,
I could see that being
and so,
driving force.
History is not always just as clean cut as sometimes short history books make it seem like. And there was a power vacuum, and this is something that's interesting. Again, the Senate had been around a long time, but the senators were getting weak. They didn't want to address the difficult questions. They didn't want to pay the price that was involved to make things right. And so whenever there's a power vacuum, when people don't lead, there's always a Julius Caesar or a Napoleon who are prepared to step into the gap.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. You can kind of see that even to this day, even in American politics, the outsider who comes in, who wants, and right now we've got one that wants to clear the swamp. And, there's a certain appeal to a certain segment of society. But it also causes a lot of people to hate you and be against you. And certainly the Senate was against Julius Caesar and saw him as a usurper, a betrayer of his class, and people didn't trust him. But nobody seemed to be able to rise up as a leader to stand up against him. And there was the system was breaking down in the Roman Senate, but nobody seemed to be able to fix it.
Yeah.
And oftentimes there's just too much vested interest in a system, even when it's broken, that people just keep putting up with a broken system that is not functioning right. And you've got all these soldiers that have no land, and Rome is filling up with homeless, poor people that have nothing to eat, and the government is not able to address that. And so they finally look to a strong man like Caesar to say, well, he'll come in and make the tough calls. And that's essentially what Caesar did. He would try to pass laws and decrees that would provide food for people and give land to veteran soldiers. And he'd appeal to the populace and not just go through all the established channels of the Senate and government. And so, interesting. Maybe just one last quote, just to give you that I kind of find interesting. It's by a person called Jacob Burckhardt. It says, "Great men are necessary for our life, in order that the movement of world history can free itself sporadically by fits and starts from obsolete ways of living and inconsequential talk." And of course, there's a great man theory that a lot of people don't like anymore and think it's kind of a dated view of history. But there are certain characters throughout history that come along, and then history is never the same after that. And the way of doing government or business or whatever else, you can't do it the same after that. And Caesar's one of those guys who came at a broken time in Roman history, and a lot of people accuse him of breaking it, but the fact is it wasn't healthy anymore. It wasn't working right. And there seems like there's always a Julius Caesar type person that will arise on the scene when things are broken and weak and ineffective. And you almost see that in just about every generation where that happens. And so, for better or worse, he's one of those towering figures of world history that you look at, and you're not sure how much he was a symptom of the problem or the cause of the problem.
Yeah.
But you certainly look back at human history and say, well, it was never the same after he appeared on the scene.
Well, a fascinating biography, a fascinating leader. And we'll leave links to in the show notes for the biography that Richard used for this. And speaking of links in the show notes, we're also going to leave a link to our next book club book, our leadership book. Richard, why don't you tell us real quickly what book we're going to be doing?
We're going to be reading Angela Duckworth's book called Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance.
All right. So look for that. We'll probably do that actually next week maybe. So grab your copy and read along with us.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.